Hello everybody, and welcome to this morning's launch of the report Working Together, the Benefits and Challenges of Coordination in the Field. We're delighted you can join us and aware that for some time zones this start is perhaps a little early, particularly for areas west of London, but we will be recording this so that colleagues can see the recording on the website. Let me just start by introducing, I'm Paul Knox-Clarke of ALNAP, and I have the privilege of hosting today's web launch. Let me start by just giving a little bit of background to this report. I think the thing is that if we were designing a humanitarian system today, we probably wouldn't design it from scratch the way it is. I think we're probably all agreed in that. It's a system with lots of different agencies and organizations with different accountabilities, different funding streams, different mandates and missions, working often under extremely difficult circumstances and tight timelines in the same place and with the same affected populations. And of course, particularly as responses get bigger, this makes the degree to which these various different organizations can work together on the ground an issue of central importance for the effectiveness of any response. And in fact, it's so important that at ALNAP, the membership and secretariat decided that this was something that we should do an annual meeting about. And so this March 2015, very kindly and generously hosted by the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs in their wonderful Welthalle. I hope for any of our German colleagues I've pronounced that correctly. The ALNAP membership met, members from across the world and across all different types of organizations to really sort of try and share experiences and get a little bit of a handle on what operational working together, that is working together really on the ground. We excluded the sort of global partnerships and so on to look very much at field-focused operations, what the benefits and challenges of coordination were. And the report that we are launching today and that will go up on our website by tomorrow morning is one which really tries to capture both the literature around this topic, but also the very many experiences of the ALNAP members and other colleagues who joined us in Berlin in March. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a brief run through of some of the key points of the report, which will be given by my colleague Luz Saavedra, about whom more later, but who was the architect of the meeting, the designer of the meeting, and also the lead author of the report. And then we will ask some colleagues from the sector, Nuno Nunes, who many of you will know, and Nuraida Rahim, to give their thoughts, their perspectives on some of the things, on the topic itself and on some of the things that Luz has said, before putting it over to a broader discussion. So let me just briefly introduce our speakers today. Luz, starting with Luz, who will be presenting. Luz has been with us in ALNAP since 2014, focusing on participation, on partnerships, and on national and local NGOs. Very exciting piece of work that, but more on that later. She was also, as I mentioned, the lead author of the report that we'll be discussing today. Before joining ALNAP, Luz worked on the ground and in management and evaluation positions in the Palestinian territories, in Colombia and Darfur, as well as in West Africa and the Horn of Africa, with a particular focus on armed conflict. Luz has a background in international and comparative law and political science, a background that she's deployed very successfully in helping us in the Secretariat understand some of these complex areas. Moving on to Nuno. Nuno Nunes is the global CCCM, and I apologize, Nuno, I'm never quite too sure how many C's to put in there, but CCCM cluster coordinator for natural disasters and works with IOM. Nuno also coordinates global efforts in displacement tracking with tools such as DTM, aiming to support a better understanding of the dynamics of displacement and the needs of displaced people. DTM teams work with technologies such as UAVs, predictive and in-depth analysis, GIS, methodologies for data collection, data protection, and modeling of mobility. And this is an area, I think, Nuno, we will come back to later, because there have already been advanced questions about technology, but also about the much broader remit that you have around the challenges of the clusters, an area which we've been working on together. And then last but by no means least, Nuraida Rahim. Nuraida currently serves as the Partnership Initiative Coordinator for Relief International. The PI, or Partnership Initiative, was established in mid-2014 and is hosted by Relief International based in Gaziantep in Turkey. It leads on very interesting issues of capacity development for Syrian NGOs working to provide humanitarian assistance inside Syria. So we have an example there of both some of the sort of partnership elements that we were talking about in our meeting, and also, of course, the sort of multi-organizational sort of networking element as well. Prior to her work with PI, Nuraida was based in Sudan from 2010, where she worked with WFP on peace building and early recovery. And previously, she's worked also with the World Bank and with Concern Worldwide. So I think you will agree we have an excellent panel. I'm afraid to say that Andrew, who's going to join us from HelpAge International, is experiencing technical trouble, and so we don't think we'll take part. But we have an excellent panel, and with no further ado, I would like to hand over to Luz. Luz.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. As Paul was saying, the ALNAP meeting last March was focusing on working together at the field level, and the annual meeting of ALNAP, it's one of those occasions where you get around 200 participants discussing together a topic that affects everyone, regardless of the constituency that they join from. So in this case, it was, as I was saying, working together in the field for an effective humanitarian response. The meeting took place in Berlin in March 2015. There were around 60 organizations and a bit below 200 participants from around 40 countries, and we insist on this because it was very important for us for this topic, where there's a lot of discussions and sometimes a bit of confusion, to get the very diverse and broad, wide spectrum of perspectives around everything that relates to coordination and other forms of collaborative approaches. So in that sense, what was interesting to see is that during the discussions that we had in Berlin, most of the people that were there were highlighting the fact that this was a very timely topic. The issues around coordination and other collaborative approaches are very much influenced and shaped by contextual issues, with the projected growth of humanitarian needs associated to phenomena like urbanization, the fact that climate change and climate change adaptation are shaping very much the way that we respond to humanitarian crisis. But as well, if we look at it from a more medium and short-term perspective, the current trends and patterns of humanitarian crisis forecast are really pushing the system that Paul was referring to respond in terms of both coverage and quality and relevance of the way that we respond. Only two examples. The forecast, for example, for El Niño this year, it's seeing whole areas of the planet in Central America, around the Sahel belt, in Southeast and South Pacific, being affected with more virulence and frequency by certain disasters. But as well, if we look at trends around complex emergencies and the strain that puts in the system, complex crises such as Central African Republic, the Syria regional crisis, including Iraq, or the situation in South Sudan and Afghanistan, we can see that regardless of where you are placed in terms of how much coordination is needed, it's a very timely topic. Another thing that was very important for us was that the feedback that we received from Berlin participants, but as well from other colleagues that are part of the network of organizations that conform ALNAP, with more than 100 organizations, was that the participants were recognizing, on one hand, that the topic was relevant, but this was specifically pointing at the fact that there was a level of articulation of the contents and discussions, and this is something that we put particular attention when designing the different discussions and debates and panels that we had in Berlin, but also when we address the vast amount of literature that exists around issues on coordination and collaborative approaches. And you will be able to see in the report that we are releasing tomorrow, but in the web page we already have the discussion started and the background paper for the Berlin meeting, that there's a wide variety of types of collaboration, types of coordination, and this diversity reflects all the different perspectives, because we're talking about a system that we call system, is very different actors and across very wide variety of contexts. So all these diverse perspectives and the fact that certain formulas may well work for, let's say, international organizations in a rapid onset response would not necessarily be appropriate for another type of response with other actors involved and so forth. But this doesn't necessarily cancel one each other. So for us it was very important to be able to portray the diversity of perspectives associated to what it means to work in the field. In that sense, I think that one of the things that was most mentioned in the feedback from participants and recognized is that from the ALNAP Secretariat, we did a particular effort of inclusiveness during the meeting, particularly when it comes to national and local actors, and this was greatly appreciated. The biggest collective among the panelists was coming from national and local actors, and of course we were very aware of this. So we had even a particular budgetary line to try to facilitate this, because it's not a matter only of interest, but it's also a matter of putting the resources to be able to include inclusiveness when we're talking about coordination and collaborative approaches. So in the report, and perhaps today in the discussions for sure is going to come up, there's a great variety of organizational relationships that were discussed. In the current slide that you can see some form of Zeppelin spectrum, and these different stages that of course are not necessarily applicable to every crisis and every actor in every moment, but it's a much more fluid and varied relationship, from complete autonomy to merger. There's all these different stages that are discussed in the report around communication, cooperation and alignment, and collaborative activities, and the different factors that influence the degree of collaborative and cooperative work associated to the context, what phase in the project cycle management, and so forth, enable us in both the discussions and the paper to be able to tackle some of the different shapes that coordination and collaborative approaches take in the field, ranging from bilateral partnerships that we have seen several types in the examples that were discussed during Berlin, in between international and national actors, local and regional actors, and so forth, but as well all the work that is being done at networks at national and regional level that is very much present. And during the discussion sometimes we were acknowledging that the degree that these networks are recognized is not necessarily homogeneous or completely acknowledging all the fora. In that sense, we have work around national actors and networks, and we invite you to check on the ALNAP webpage on some of the lessons that have been drawn in that area. Another of the types of organizational relationships that we discussed were the families of organizations. Recently, we launched the State of the Humanitarian System, edition 2015. And for example, some people were commenting around the fact that out of the 5 biggest international organizations in terms of budget and coverage of activities and number of employees, most of them are families of organizations, including Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, World Vision, and so forth, and only one of them, like the IERC, it's a single organization. So families of organizations and all those internal debates that sometimes are not necessarily in the public sphere were a very interesting discussion indeed. And of course, you cannot avoid having discussion around coordination and collaborative approaches without taking into account the formal coordination mechanisms. And I think here there's 3 things that are important to highlight. One of them is that both in the literature and in the discussions in Berlin, we acknowledge there has been a great deal of an effort in terms of testing and improving the formal coordination mechanisms. And in the last decade, we have seen a great effort that is starting to bear fruits. And I'm hoping that our panelist, Nuno Núñez, can share some of these around clusters and so forth. The second thing is that formal coordination mechanisms, when they are absent, and this was very clear in the debates in Berlin, the different actor systems try to mimic how they work. So definitely there's something interesting there. And despite of the many challenges, when there are no clusters, we try to replicate them somehow. So that's really an interesting perspective. But one of the things that we also addressed in the report, and I'm not going to extend here because it certainly is going to come in the debate, is that beyond the formal coordination mechanisms, there are many other different formulas that exist. And at the end of the day, the system is also composed by individuals, and the informal and tacit level of coordination, the way that we share information about delicate issues such as security management and so forth, has been very present in the field. And it's a factor that, despite the fact that it's less addressed in literature, we definitely took into account when we were having our discussions. As we were saying, many different types of actors, many different types of contexts. When we discuss inter-organizational relationships, they are so central to what we call the humanitarian sector that the discussions very often and clearly evolve towards discussing what are the strengths, the potentials and challenges of the humanitarian system itself. So often and quickly sometimes when we're discussing coordination, the discussion turns into what is it that this particular humanitarian response is intending to achieve. The discussion rapidly evolves into which are the different approaches and how we can achieve those benefits that the system as a whole should be able to make proof of, around coverage, around the relevance of the response, around the issue that in a world with increasing needs and competition among institutions and agencies, we cannot afford not to be efficient and effective. And a lot of these discussions that rapidly translate into what are the core issues that we can see in the humanitarian sector were very interesting to see, because we were able to, on one hand, see that different formulas work for different contexts, but the cookie cutter approach is certainly not one that we can apply to every crisis and to every type of relationship between actors. And secondly, that from this diversity, there are certain trends and patterns that we were trying to establish and extract on what a timely and recognized response may have. The three core elements in this discussion that blurs the borders between what is coordination and what is humanitarian action, successful humanitarian action looks like. In the Berlin discussions, and also as you will see in the report, revolve around these three core elements. In one hand, there's the number of actors involved. As I was saying, in the launch of the State of the Humanitarian System 2015 that is available in the ALNAP webpage, we are talking about below 5,000 different organizations. But it's not only when we say the actors involved is because we want to bring upon these very important nuance. There's some actors that define themselves as humanitarian and are usually named when we talk about these topics. It's the UN agencies, the international non-governmental organizations, national actors, and of course everything that is related to the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and different types of organizations that are defining themselves as humanitarians. But actors involved with far beyond that. The primary responses often come from the governments themselves, where they are setting up the responses. The diaspora groups have a big role to play, religious groups the same thing. Often in many of the interventions, the military play a particularly important role. So those actors involved come from different backgrounds, different mandates, different objectives, and different levels of expertise. And it's within this diversity that we have to place the debate around coordination and other collaborative approaches. A debate that would be very interesting but certainly incomplete if we do not address issues around power relationships and the imbalances that we see in the sector in that sense. Power matters, and that was repeated by virtually every person that was engaging in the discussions in Berlin, and also because not all the types of coordination are the same. We have seen vivid debates around the issue that coordination is triggered by command, driven by a position of power and authority, and we have seen several different examples where the perceptions are that certain actors are holding the stick and the rest are knocking on the door. That changes very much from coordination by consensus, when different actors involved in a particular response decide to join forces and to determine the scope and the magnitude of the coordination and the collaborative approaches that they are going to achieve, very much linked to the level of ambitions around objectives and so forth. Coordination can be challenging, and it's important. I think it was very important that when we were trying to define what a coordination of a successful response look like, there was quite a lot of clarity around those elements that you should certainly try to avoid or keep control over. So coordination can be really challenging when it fails to include the key stakeholders that are involved in the response. There's numerous debates in our sector around the fact that localization of aid remains many times at a rhetoric level and it's difficult to achieve. There's issues around how to include key stakeholders that do not necessarily share the same modus operandi, principles and values that you are defending humanitarian work to. But at the same time, there's an awareness and a practicality of feasibility filter there, if you want, that coordination is not necessarily desirable with everyone all the time at all times, because the feasibility of doing that puts real questions around the fact that we are present in the countries to respond to the crisis. So finding the balance between inclusion and practicality of coordination bodies is far from an obvious one. When we were talking about power, we are talking about what kind of requisites and what are the demands in terms of what we are asking to the coordination system. I particularly appreciate that in one of the panels there was a person that was coming from an evaluation, a very extensive evaluation of the cluster systems, that was saying, listen, we don't have shortage of ideas on what the clusters, or by extension any coordination structure, should be able to do. The problem is much more on determining, okay, we're going to focus on these three key areas, hence those three key areas are going to be worked upon in detriment of which ones. So which are the logics that we apply to continue with certain things or stress certain things and drop others. And coordination can be really challenging when there is an excessive focus on extraction of information and a critique towards this tendency towards upwards accountability, which is obviously one of the risks when we have a supply-driven system. While at the same time, any person that you ask what is happening with the money that taxpayers are contributing in order to have budgets around response, everybody would say, well, obviously it has to be transparent and account for, and so on and so forth. So whether it is around coordination by command or by consensus, the issues around inclusiveness and the issues around the desire to keep everyone on board while being able to be effective and have timely and relevant responses, and the issues around what requirements are we asking to coordination, how much information is being produced from there, are, I think, three interesting areas where we can clearly see that there's benefits and challenges around coordination. I would invite all the people that are listening to us today or that will listen to this webinar in the SoundCloud that we will make available in the webpage to check out other works that ALNAP has been doing around coordination, because the topic certainly is complex and the nuances are important, and for us it was important to put a bit the dots on the i's. So exploring coordination in humanitarian clusters is a report that we have released this year, but also, and I'm sure that this is going to come up in the debate as well, when we're talking about coordination and collaborative approaches, in the operational arena, we have to think in terms of leadership and how much of this trade between chaos and control, that is another of the studies that we have published recently, and I invite all the attendees to check. So to sum up, benefits and challenges and coordination is certainly not necessarily something that we can say in black and white. Many degrees of gray in between. It's definitely a timely topic, and it was recognized by our participants in that sense. The variety and diversity of actors, contexts, and relationships very often brings the discussion of coordination to the very central areas of the humanitarian sectors around the actors, the diversity, the power relationships that exist among them, and the imbalances as well. I think that it's important that we take the time to be able to review around this diversity and to be able to acknowledge that the discussion is a very timely one and a very relevant one when we look at the scenario and the complexities of current humanitarian trends with the projected increase in needs, with the clear increase in diversity and number of actors. Coordination is something that definitely we can learn a lot from. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Luth. As we can all see, this is a massive topic. And actually, while you were speaking, I'm looking out of the window here in Blackfriars, and there's a wall opposite the window. And I was thinking how interesting it is that when one looks at a wall, one tends to think about the bricks, but not about the mortar. But really, what you're talking to us about here, Luth, is the mortar, is what holds all these things together and stops it falling down. And there's some really interesting points there about, not all coordination is the same. There are different levels, different objectives in coordination, about the sort of difference of belief about what humanitarianism is, and so how that can influence coordination. And I was really also struck with this idea about the difference between coordinating and being coordinated, and what that means, how the power works out in the relationship. And these are many things, so thank you so much for that. I would just like to remind everyone out there that you have a questions tab on your on the right hand side of your screen, and please feel free to type in any questions. We will put them to Luz and also to Nuno and Narayda in a minute, so do please get those questions coming in. But before that, I would like to hand over straight away to Nuno to see what your reflections on this and on the meeting and the topic in general are. Nuno, please.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everybody. I think some of the points that Luz touched upon, they speak very closely to some of the work we have been doing inside the cluster that I co-coordinate, but also with other clusters. And there are a couple of them that I would like to isolate from the rest. One is on the topic of, from our side, we have been calling it citizen-driven assistance, and how our clusters, and as Luz explained, that the primary actors or the primary response is very often provided by governments, national actors, civil society, religious groups, etc. That is perhaps even more so in the camp management cluster or the CCCM cluster. Most of our constituency, let's say so, tends to be not the international organizations and so on, but these civil society and national actors. So integrating the views of a constituency that is not represented in global meetings in Geneva and so on has been one major challenge for us, and that we are looking at. Indeed, not all coordination is the same, and I think that on that one we have sometimes, depending on the meetings, and even during the Berlin meeting, like some groups would say that humanitarians were going no matter where in the world and try to apply the same coordination system, and other groups were saying no, that's not true. Like indeed there is like a system or a structure, architecture that has been discussed that involves clusters and some minimum coordination structures, but the way in which these clusters tend to operate in different countries over the years became very, very different. And I tend to agree more with the second, the way in which we work in camp management in South Sudan or in Nepal or in the Philippines or in Bolivia, it's extremely different and includes a lot of different actors with very different roles and responsibilities from one country to another. So there is indeed like a lot of gray areas in between, and that we should try to find ways to explore. Over.
Great, thanks, Nuno, and I hope we can take up this issue in a minute, because certainly it's something that we found as well in our research on the clusters, that people talk about a sort of monolithic, one-size-fits-all coordination system, but actually the reality on the ground seems to be a much more diverse and system which people, the people involved, the cluster coordinators and IMs and people have adapted quite skillfully. So maybe this is an area we can come back to. Thank you for that. Moving on very specifically to perhaps the greatest humanitarian challenge geographically that we're facing. Nuraida, maybe you would like to give us some thoughts, coming particularly where you're coming from, the challenge around the Syrian regional emergency.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning. Actually, it's good afternoon all the way from Gaziantep, Turkey here. I have to say, just to add to the complexity of our discussions today, is that we see cluster coordination, and I've been a cluster coordinator myself, is that it tends to be one country specific. But with the Syria crisis response, we're looking at the whole of Syria, of which we're talking about a Turkey coordination hub, a Jordan coordination hub, Lebanon, and then Iraq. And we're also partly in coordination with agencies and partners working inside Syria, even the ones in Damascus. So we're looking at another complex layer of how not just to do coordination with a multitude of partners in one country, but coordinating that efforts throughout 3 countries, of which I imagine it is a challenge, but at the same time just extremely needed, particularly given the complexity of the whole entire operations, that no UN agencies, no INGOs are operating inside Syria. We're all doing cross-border work, cross-line work. So I think that brings another layer of how that sort of coordination from what we thought we knew before can actually work in this sort of context, and what works, what doesn't work. And the reality is that I think we're all coming from a view where this is the first time that we're faced with such a challenge, with sort of very set of different factors, different complexities, different partners. You're not just dealing with the crisis itself. I mean, in Turkey, you're also dealing with the sort of refugees coming in at the same time with the government of Turkey, and taking that into consideration, and then considering what's going on in Jordan and in Lebanon and so on. So I think sometimes we must remember when in that sort of coordination situation, is to also take 2 steps back and see what actually works and what has not. Because we're moving too fast, in my opinion, trying to address every urgent need, because there's always something urgent happening with regard to Syria today, and we're just trying to keep up with that sort of humanitarian crisis and needs, that along the way we haven't figured out how best we can work with each other, taking what works and changing and be flexible if what doesn't work and so on. So that's sort of something that we've noticed around here. And in relation to that, because we're working with a diverse group of partners, not just UN agencies, INGOs, Syrian NGOs, Turkish NGOs, there's a multitude of partners with sort of very different, how do I put it, power relations to each other. And this is what Luz was saying much earlier, the power relationship and imbalances, the competition for sort of their voices, their representation at cluster meetings, not just in Turkey, but because a lot of Syrian NGOs, for example, can't go to regional meetings in Amman or in Beirut, who's actually taking those voices on their behalf and actually doing justice to it and addressing what needs to be addressed. So that sort of coordination and the need to come together has also sort of bring about the sort of, I wouldn't say necessarily competition, but a lot of discussions in terms of voice representation, a gender representation, who's speaking on behalf of the Syrians, and so on. So.
Thank you very much. I think that, those two things speak very well to each other, because I had a question for Nuno about when one's dealing with community representation and having to involve this in the camps. How do you know actually who is a legitimate voice of the community? A challenge I'm sure you've met with, Nuno. So maybe we can put that on the question list. But we've got loads of questions before mine, which should be privileged before mine. One which has come up several times already, and which I'm going to put to all three of you, if I may, is the question of competition as against coordination. We know that humanitarian organizations are often competing for funds. So how can organizations which are in a situation of competition for funds work effectively together? And I'd like to ask, particularly if you've got any really concrete suggestions or concrete examples for today's participants, if you could be as concrete as possible. Luth, maybe you'd like to start.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I think that I'm going to play a bit the devil's advocate in this case, and I'm going to break the fence for this competition for funds, because sometimes humanitarian actors that are operational in the field only change behavior and actions through external pressure. And I think that we are very adamant and vocal when we criticize sometimes some of the approaches that donors take. However, I have to say that from field experience and from also looking at the vast amount of literature that exists, some of the pushes that, and the conditionalities and requirements from donor perspective have been in fact positive in changing certain things. I think that some of the advances that we have seen recently in the inclusion of something that everybody talks about but is very difficult to achieve, of proper gender perspective in the way that we collect and analyze the data that we bring, it has been triggered by this competition of funds and by the fact that some donors have set up conditionalities around gender. Probably a lot of my colleagues are not very happy that I bring this subject, but I think it's important to say that sometimes external pressure is the one that brings up changes that are positive in the sector. In that sense, working together through a competition has brought up certain transversal and transect issues like gender or protection with much more force than it would have done if we would have waited for every agency in a single way to adopt certain of the pushes from a more systemic perspective.
Okay, so Luth, turning the question on its head there, but I think very legitimately to tell us how funding can actually drive coordination as well as impede it, which is an important consideration. In terms of balancing it so that you get the best out of the driving and coordination and the least out of the impeding coordination, Nuno, could I go to you and this question of how maybe cluster members and more generally organizations can work together when they're competing for funds? Well, what are your experiences here?
Thank you, Paul. I think that the appeal process is at country level. Were supposedly a coordination tool, or are supposed to be a coordination tool that clusters like ours use to discuss with different partners what is a priority, sometimes changing a bit some of the geographical areas because everybody is applying for funds for a particular area, so those discussions tend to happen, and so on. So that is at the level of cluster. Then at the intercluster, then of course we have been talking about like cross-cluster initiatives and outputs and outcomes and so on. But I feel that somehow agencies, or perhaps the cluster, the appeals that happen at country level as a coordination tool, could they be replicated at different global levels? Meaning, if different agencies are working, let's say, on information management, mainstreaming GBV, mainstreaming a number of cross-cutting factors, should we have like a coordination mechanism also at the global level that would allow us between us and donors and between different clusters to actually align priorities and therefore make our agencies at country level already have a bit of aligned priorities. I feel that many of the problems that will tend to happen are driven by insistence, or even, as Luz explained, the funding pressure sometimes at global levels for a certain agency to do more at country level when at global level that has not been coordinated. This said, also there are you know, not everything in terms of competition should be seen, and sorry if I'm not as radical, I think that it's difficult to see everything in black and white. I think that competition to some extent also has enabled some of the organizations to become more effective in the assistance being provided to people, and that should remain at the center of our discussion. Lastly, maybe to talk about how from our cluster we see a lot of coordination happening at operational level. So some of our camp managers that are working in a camp do a lot of coordination between actors at a very operational, almost invisible level. And we have been trying to work with the colleagues from OCHA and intercluster coordination in trying to explore areas of, you know, where could be the links between the very operational level and management and some of the current discussions in intercluster coordination at the country level.
Thank you very much, Nuno. Very thoughtful, and also this point about actually competition not being necessarily a bad, and of course coordination not necessarily being a good, if it stifles innovation and improvements of effectiveness. Maybe Nuraida, I can ask if you have experience of this, and is there anything that from your perspective you've done to be able to mitigate the negative effects of competition?
Yeah, let me just, for example, give a common example sort of that we see around here. Let's talk about the Humanitarian Pool Fund. And we're looking at that as being the most accessible funding for Syrian NGOs, because institutional donors like DFID, ECHO, USAID, OFDA don't provide direct funding to local organizations. They do it through an INGO or through a UN agency, and these organizations then contract a sub-grantee and so on. One of the things in that regards we've noticed is that when we have a pool fund, and we want to increase the level of local NGOs attaining those funds. But we're also allowing, in that sense, a competition to open up to a wider spectrum, which is good. I mean, we're also sort of limiting the opportunity for those funds to be able to go to local organizations who are a lot cheaper and probably more effective in implementation than UN organizations and INGOs. One of the things, and these might seem, I don't know, this is at the top of my head, I would say, for instance, there needs to be more, if UN agencies, for instance, or NGOs are assessing funds, whichever donors, there should be an understanding or a commitment that some of those funds, and perhaps majority of those funds, should be entailed or sort of like, sub-granted out to a local organizations, with the idea and with the long-term sort of more long-term approach to support these local institutions to fulfill, their capacity, so that in the long term, beyond the emergency crisis, that they can also address the sort of early recovery needs, development needs, and so forth. And one other thing, is that UN agencies are really expensive. I hear this a lot from a lot of my local partners, that even when they receive grants from UN agencies, INGOs, a certain percentage, and probably a high percentage of it, is chopped off for administrative fees and so on. And there's very little left to go to actual implementation. So we also need to start sort of questioning, if we have competition over funds, are we really using funds in the right way? Or is it going to a lot of things that, are just really the costs of how we're functioning, is it necessarily needed to be that expensive?
Very interesting idea there. Thank you for more consideration of cost effectiveness as a driver for funding choices, which would then allow perhaps more healthy competition, because that seems to be one thing that we're talking about, how to make competition healthy. And in a similar, if I may add myself, a similar point is maybe thinking about coordination beyond thinking about coordination structures, and instead thinking, as we did a little bit at the meeting, around using standards or general standard operating procedures, ways of working as coordination mechanisms. So rather than by cooperating through everyone joining a group, cooperating by everyone agreeing to use the same rules, you then can have everyone working in the same basic way, but the competition for funding becomes less destructive because there isn't a group there to destroy. And so that's perhaps another way of going about this sort of balancing coordination and competition. And I'm sure there are many other ideas out there. If you do have any or any experiences, just type them in and we'll read them out for the a whole of the participants. In the meantime, we have many questions coming in. I'd like to go straight to you again, Nuno, if I can. We're asked by Daniel if we have any success stories we can learn from or model. I'm sure in your experience you should have quite a number. So success stories of coordination, and maybe just a word on, what you think the key element of success there was.
I think that I touched a bit upon it, but maybe I'll talk a bit more to it. There is, when a camp, or when I talk about camps in the CCCM context, I'm also referring to evacuation centers, emergency shelters, collective centers, like anything that, like a settlement of people that has some sort of governance structure, and that we tend to facilitate the management of it. I think that, and not all our camp managers are good or are representative of all the community that is within the camp, but in many cases they are, or they tend to play a good facilitation between actors able to provide assistance to the population there. So I would put that, and that has been in discussions also with our colleagues at TOCHA, as an actual good experience in terms of coordination. We have seen in multiple locations actors getting together in some sort of geographical area approach, being it a camp or a neighborhood, and in those cases having someone that sort of coordinates operations and requirements and so on. It also helps, like in the advocacy for the resources that are not available. Now, what we seem to feel from the camp management perspective, and bear in mind that I talk for half of it, like I could lead the cluster with our colleagues from UNHCR for conflict. But in a camp management, from a camp management perspective, we see such a gap between this very operational coordination that tends to be happening in so many different locations at the same time, and then our intercluster coordination at a more central level in these countries. So we have actually trying to use the lessons learned or the good experiences from some of these operational coordination mechanisms and try to link them with the intercluster coordination. Right now we have like some sort of framework or log frame between, explaining a bit how could the links between a camp manager, a camp coordinator, and an intercluster coordinator could be could be better understood and better explored to improve efficiency.
Thank you, Nuno. And same question to you, I think, Luth, from the meeting. Did we have any examples, really successful examples of the meeting, and what lay behind their success?
Thank you, Paul. And it's very interesting that Nuno was talking about this gap between operational coordination and in the intercluster level, because I think that one of the examples that we all appreciate from Berlin meeting was the one from the Central African Republic education cluster. We have in our webpage available the stories in 5, and one of them was by Nicola from Bangui. It was a very interesting example because of, if I may, 5 things. First of all, the education sector in emergencies, it's one that we often see that has difficulties in terms of visibility and in terms of funding and so forth. So what triggered this whole coordination approach was precisely the opportunity to have a funding opportunity that required a joint work between different actors. Taking into account the difficulties of the logistics and the security constraint, there's 3 elements, there's 3 clear benefits that emerge from this example. And it's that very different actors all around geographically spread Bangui managed to get together, increasing the coverage of the activities precisely because the education cluster had at the time the biggest and most active number of partners geographically spread all around the country. So that enabled that the data collection that was necessary to achieve this funding to launch all these activities in education was successful much more than other sectorial perspectives, if you want. Secondly, it was really relevant because some of the knowledge gaps that we had around geographical areas of cut it off because of the conflict going on beyond the education system were able to be covered thanks to this network of very active partners. But thirdly, and it's a criteria that sometimes we struggle to find specific examples, there was the connectedness issue, and that's why it's interesting what Nuno was saying. Because from inception, this project of data collection and launching activities was very much thought of putting an effort in linking the different clusters at Bangui level with the different local actors, both from the Ministry of Education and the different partners of the cluster, together to have this better idea of how things were working. And if I may, I also would like to share another example from Berlin, that it's again an example that is successful, but it's not successful in a kind of candid way, because also shows us some of the challenges around coordination. In this case from Lebanon and Jordan, where lots of organizations are working around cash. So the positive issue was there that a wide variety of actors ranging from humanitarian UN organizations and NGOs, but also banks and mobile companies in the Middle East got together, and their objective was beyond the classic increasing the coverage of the beneficiaries from the cash project, but more working towards harmonization. So the fact that there was a real effort into trying to get the same data from which everybody was going to design and drive their projects brought a lot of interesting elements around relevance and interesting discussions about how to work together. However, the challenging part of harmonization with regards to cash, that being a cross-cutting issue, touches upon all the different sectorial areas and coordination mechanisms, was that it was a very time-consuming exercise. So although the benefits were very clear, because harmonization enabled to increase most of the benefits that we would see from an OECD DAC criteria perspective, it was also time-consuming, which puts questions around timeliness and which puts back questions around how do we mitigate the fact that coordination is often not simple, it requires resources and dealing with a high level of complexity. So what are the prices that we pay, and where do we find that balance in that sense? Yeah.
Thank you, Luth. I'd just like to bring us back as well a little bit to round out with a couple of additional points that our participants in the webinar have made. Going back to this, because it does seem to keep coming up, this balance that you were talking about, Luth, achieving, the balance between You know, when is it worth doing coordination and when not? And how do you balance competition, which can be healthy, against competition that is unhealthy? And although these have been phrased as questions, I'd just like to throw these suggestions, slightly change them, and throw them into the conversation as suggestions for how to deal with the issue of competition. Raynor, thank you for that, is talking about consortia and the use of consortia as a mechanism for addressing competition. This may be something, if we have time, we come back to, but certainly I think at the meeting there were examples of consortia being a good way of addressing competition issues, and also of consortia being important because there you know that everybody has decided that they've got, you know, that it is worth coming together. It is what you said earlier in the presentation. It's a voluntary coming together, and so you know, the balance, the cost-benefit balance there is rather good. The ECB consortium in Indonesia, I think, was a good example of this. And then Caroline de Vast is also putting it as a question, but I think it's an important point about competition, and one that Nuno touched on a minute ago, is the concept of the firewall between the cluster coordination and the operational agency leading the cluster. Actually, in the meeting, Caroline, and in the separate work we've done on coordination, this concept of the firewall, of the cluster coordinating body agency not having operational direction of the cluster, is absolutely vital. And this is particularly true when it comes to funding, where what we've seen in many of the clusters that's been successful is a subcommittee, if you like, exists purely to do the funding allocations, and often the lead agency is not involved in that, or hasn't, you know, mechanisms put in place to have the lead agency have an equal role rather than a more powerful role on that. So I think the firewall is very important, and there is more on that in this report and also in the cluster report that we did. I'll move to another question now. Narida, this one's for you. Magali Morlon, and I'm sure I have mangled your family name, Magali, for which I apologize, program coordinator at Voice, asks, what can we expect from the World Humanitarian Summit in relation to the issue of coordination, and how can we further promote the principles of partnership? I'm going to throw that one over to you, Narida. If anyone, again, online has any thoughts that they would like to type in as answers to Magali's questions, please do. But in the first instance, Narida, what can we expect from the WHS, and how can we further promote the principles of partnership?
Thank you, Paul. I think the World Humanitarian Summit, which is going to happen in May 2016, next year in Istanbul, is a timely event because it is consistently trying to advocate for the necessity to bring, you know, people affected by crisis at the center of its agenda and so on. And its focus has been coordinating the sort of different, you know, elements of working in this humanitarian industry. I think it has about sort of like 4 main thematic agendas, which is sort of humanitarian effectiveness, reducing risk, and let me just look at my notes, managing vulnerability, innovation, and sort of serving the needs of people who are at risk. So I think we, in my opinion, I mean, as somebody who's been in sort of working on this sort of, the only thing I've done in my entire professional life is this, is that I do expect a lot, but I'm also very cautious about another layer of a summit, you know, slash forum that tries maybe to, you know, broadly to bring all of these different complex elements together and see what can, you know, what we can come out of it, and see how we can sort of reshape and move humanitarian aid better and how we do things better. So I do expect a lot from the summit next year, but I'm also very cautious how sometimes big summits and forums tend to be a lot of rhetoric and less in terms of sort of how does it trickle down to the very people that we, you know, claim to be helping. And then sort of alongside with that, you know, the principles of partnership has, you know, was adopted in 2007, looking at, you know, a range of principles, transparency, equality, I think there was results orientation and responsibility and so on. It does provide an sort of an overall framework on how, you know, we should be working. You know, it's an ideal framework of how we should be working, to be engaged with partners on a more equal, constructive, and sort of, you know, an open, transparent environment. It is a relevant sort of principle, and I've been in a lot of ways in this current, you know, work I do, trying to keep pushing that particularly because it is relevant. But it is also something that needs to be contextualized to suit the sort of situation we're working in. Partnering up in Sudan and partnering up in Syria or in anywhere else in the Middle East is going to be very different, and we need to recognize that. We need to acknowledge that partners here, even though we're very successful in somewhere else, it's not that just we bring a whole lot of assessment tools and so on and dump it on our local partner here or another partner and assume that would just, you know, follow the usual time frame. And there will be sort of a lot of operational difficulties, particularly I think in sort of, you know, transparency in financial and accounting situations, inclusion in coordination, how do we ensure our partners are equally, you know, consulted, are involved in the coordination mechanism, in the process, in the conversations, in the policy setting, information sharing, and so on. That's part of, you know, partnership management broadly. And two other things I like to sort of raise, and this is by experience of what I've seen a lot here in the past year at least, is that when we talk about partnerships, and to move forward, we need to really genuinely commit ourselves to making that partnership work. We're not talking about partnerships where one organization, you know, partner up to one, sign an agreement, and then they do implementation and deliver X, Y, Z. We're talking about a commitment to joint planning, to, you know, joint implementation, and you know, beyond the sort of one is a contractor and the other one is just a SAP grantee. We're talking about an equal level of collaborativeness, and this is something I'm sure a lot of people working in this industry don't see very often. And the other thing is to, I mean, if I could, you know, sort of encourage one way, and we've seen one good practice here. When it comes to partnering, sometimes donors in general, we need to take a little bit more of a risk-taking approach that is not going to be perfect. There will be pockets of capacity gaps and so on that we'll identify or see in partners, but we need to sort of sometimes take a leap of faith and, you know, sort of be flexible on how we can manage those difficulties instead of like completely, we don't want to be involved and, you know, we can't address those. Those are within, you know, beyond the limit of our sort of role as a donor. We need to take a bit more risk, practice a bit more flexibility, and in a lot of ways, as a lot of my local partners say, there needs to be a little faith in how we can work as partners together.
Thank you, Narida. And also, particularly for some of your thoughts, I'd just like to back up on the WHS. You know, it's not a magic wand, is it? And it's interesting to note that a lot of the communication coming from the WHS over the last few weeks has talked about it very much as being a platform for existing initiatives rather than necessarily something which by itself and without the support of humanitarians is going to achieve massive change. So certainly where there are good practices going on and things are working and can be replicated in the sector, I back up the sense that we should probably get on with those things and do them rather than sitting back and waiting for someone to come and sort it out for us. On which note, going to a very practical problem which is brought up here by Inga Grunwegen, again a family name which I apologize if I've mangled, Inga. Inga asks if the meeting also looked at cross-sectoral partnerships, which can be even more challenging given differences in culture and practice, and then gave the examples of multi-stakeholder coalitions involving government and private sector actors, for example, and civil society actors as well. I'd like to throw this one straight back to you, Nuno, because you've been talking earlier on about citizen-driven assistance, and so kind of going out beyond the working with the traditional international humanitarian organization. And I wonder, you know, is this working with civil society, working with local government in the camps, camp coordination management, is that more difficult than other forms of coordination? And if so, why? And what do you do about it?
I don't think it is more difficult, and at this point is not unexpected. Let me give you an example. Like I started as a camp manager in East Timor and other conflict settings, and was then moved into Bolivia during the displacement crisis back in, I don't know, 2006 or 7. And arrived there as the cluster coordinator, as they called me. And my counterpart in the government was the deputy of the vice minister for civil defense. And on our first meeting, I was told that I wasn't there to coordinate anything. I was there like to work with the government. So since then, in our views on cluster coordination in natural disasters, that was because of floods in the Amazonian area, has been very clear that governments and civil society play from the very beginning like a very important role. And in terms of managing population that is displaced, there is no expectation that we can do that as an international organization when going into countries that tend to have like well-structured, strong civil protection, national disaster management agencies and other forms of civil defense. So in those cases, and in most countries affected by natural disasters, you will tend to see from the very first week a lot of people that have been hosted by someone from the private sector that got together like a group of volunteers to manage the location where people are being accommodated. You'll see a lot of religious groups leading and supporting the management, but also providing a lot of assistance in terms of NFIs and so on. You would see like last year in the Bosnia and Serbia floods, like, you know, like NFIs that I had never seen in other emergency, and that were being provided by civil society. A number of donations that was incredibly high. Still, the way in which we tend to portray in all these different emergencies the work of the humanitarian community just purely disregards that the largest proportion of assistance will be coming very early on from the civil society. How to interconnect with civil society in these locations, I think, is a challenge that us as clusters will have. Are we, as a global cluster, are we like a group of people that meet in Geneva or other central locations and bringing together actors that make part of the headquarters of the different organizations represented in that cluster, or are we a sum of all the clusters at country level that make efforts to interconnect with civil society and other members of that are providing assistance? So I think that's where a bit of the technology in some cases can help us in keeping in touch with a much broader constituency. But still, I don't think we have the recipe to make sure that our strategic plans of action, appeals, etc., actually are are interconnected with what is happening at country level, driven by citizens and by governments of those countries.
That raises a fascinating question about coordination. Of course, we were only looking at the operational level, but of course, no, you're quite right. Many of the constraints to operational level coordination and to contextualizing the cooperation mechanisms lie further upstream, perhaps. And this is certainly an area. Maybe this goes back to the WHS. This is the sort of area that maybe the WHS we would hope would be looking at, those kind of upstream elements. I'd like to keep the same question about, if you like, newly acknowledged or non-traditional actors in the coordination mechanism, and just go over to you, Luth, from the meeting, and just to see if there were any particularly interesting points that stood out for you from the meeting and in the report.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, in fact, there were a couple ones, and also around perceptions that we have discussed often that are very important when we're talking about coordination and collaborative approaches of very different actors with very different mandates and so forth. I think that I would highlight that when it comes to the private sector, there's a bit sometimes an automatism of thinking of very big companies and the way that get involved in responses, which was challenged by both the literature and the examples brought in the Berlin discussions. Because as Nuno was saying, the close links between civil society and small traders and commerce people that have been often the first one to respond, but this is something that has been happening since centuries, and it's motivated by this community and community solidarity and so forth. And it was an example that was again discussed during the cash session around the Middle East, how small bakeries or small traders were joining forces with voluntary groups and being the first ones to respond, and sometimes in the most innovative and flexible ways. But on the other hand, when it comes to private sector, to much bigger companies and the ones that we can have in mind, I think that it was from the discussions in Berlin clear that there has been an evolution in the perception on both senses, both from humanitarians and from certain big companies, in the sense that these big companies, perhaps 12, 15 years ago, were much more seen as a source of potential fundraising, and this has evolved into some concrete examples, still less important than we may think. Our calculations in the state of the humanitarian system is that for big partnerships with private sector, we're talking around 12% for certain types of context responses, and not all of them. But in those that has happened, the shift has been much more from purely fundraising actors into much more strategic partnerships. And during the Berlin discussions, and this is highlighted in one of the boxes in the report, we were seeing interesting cases around very different companies that end up doing a big partnership, initially with the Red Cross movement, but then much larger with other organizations of international NGOs and the UN around the Ebola response, because these, as well as other natural disaster crises, are crises that touch upon everybody. And because the level of affectation is everywhere, the private sector, with regards to Ebola in the 3 affected countries, had a very interesting evolution in terms of what was the initial interest, and they wanted to help, but also how this triggered a whole platform for discussion between humanitarians and private sector that was positive in the sense that achieved results, but beyond that, it also enabled to challenge some of the preconceptions and ideas that both sectors might have of each other. So that was an interesting one. I invite people to read upon.
Great, thank you, Luth. The thing that comes across from both of those answers for me, one of the things, of course, is that in order to work with a variety of different actors, these approaches to coordination need to be flexible and adaptable enough to support initiatives that are already existing in terms of coordinated or multi-organizational response. And so maybe if we walk it back, a lot of the challenge about working with in an effective way in coordination, and particularly an effective way at bringing other actors in, is to take a model which starts by filling gaps rather than a model that starts just by kind of imposing itself. And this obviously is the area that the clusters and many other mechanisms are working towards. And in doing so, of course, there are always going to be hiccups and bumps and difficulties and misunderstandings. And Isaac Otabor is asking, what are the major causes of misunderstanding among humanitarian workers from different organizations? I think this is a particular, the major causes of misunderstanding is a particularly interesting question, perhaps in the context of Gaziantep, Narida, where you are. What, maybe without spilling any secrets, we could ask you for the one or two major challenges and misunderstandings that you see in your work in the partner initiative.
Without spilling secrets, I say sometimes maybe 2 points. I would say perhaps one of the key misunderstanding has been, as initially I thought it was very interesting when Luz brought up the too much coordination, because what we feel around here, and I don't think it's just a local NGO perception or feelings about it, but also within a lot of us working here, there is a lot of coordination, but too much coordination, too much consultation actually, that everybody needs to get involved in every layer, that we miss a lot of things in between, because you can't keep up with a number of emails about certain document that you need to look into and so on. And the other thing is, alongside with that sort of coordination, sort of too much consultation, is there's also a lot of meetings. I've never in my entire life been to so many meetings trying to coordinate or be consulted on every single step of the way. But this brings us back to the sort of like the need to balance between having enough coordination so that things are moving along, or having too much coordination and things are just being held back. And another interesting point, just to talk about misunderstanding and in relation to competition, is the issue of information sharing. A lot of, in general, the perception here is that a lot of local partners are very resistant and often cautious about information sharing, for example, to the clusters about where the projects are, what it's doing, sharing 4Ws of what's going on inside Syria to the clusters coordinator, because sometimes they worry that information feeds back into, Damascus. And this is a recurrent problem, because a lot of these things are because people are just generally suspicious, and that creates a lot of sort of unnecessary, misunderstanding and, perception that we feed off upon each other. I mean, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't profess to say that is a solution to that, but I think at the end of the day, it's how we sort of manage and limit those sort of like, miscommunication before it, snowballs into something that just goes out of proportion. We need to be very, very cautious about how we sort of do that, I think, as, aid workers in general.
Thank you so much. And this issue, the issue of information management, information sharing, of course, underlies so much of the coordination work, both formally and the informal coordination that we see. And so thank you for bringing that up, Narida. It is an element which is also discussed in the report, and an element that I know we are actually going to be taking forward, looking particularly at the clusters. And Nuno, I know that there were some issues you'd hoped to raise in this webinar around information management and technology in information management, which maybe we can hold over for our next discussion around IM and coordination. For now, I'd just like to say, sorry, I'm having a note put at me which I can't quite read without my glasses on. I'd just like to conclude by thanking everybody for participating, thanking in particular our speakers, Luz, Narida, and Nuno. The report will be available, as I suggested, on the web page of the annual meeting from tomorrow morning. And as Luz helpfully reminded us, there is already a lot of material there, including 5 examples of, sort of success, the stories in 5 videos, which you can you can watch, and it is, as it says, it's stories in 5, so each one is only 5 minutes, so you can watch and have a cup of coffee and learn at the same time. Thank you so much for joining. This was a very successful annual meeting. I will just say at this point that the next ALNAP annual meeting for ALNAP members will not take place in March, as would normally be the case, because we have decided with the steering committee to postpone the annual meeting until after next year's World Humanitarian Summit. So there will be more on the next ALNAP annual meeting coming up in the next few months, but be looking at a date after, towards the end of 2016 or the beginning of 2017. For now, thank you very much again to our speakers, and thank you all for joining. We hope you have a very successful and safe day.